What would you do if the people who loved you spent 7 years laughing at your life, and you had the power to shut them up in one sentence, but you chose silence instead? Stay until the end, because the moment this man finally spoke is something you will not forget. If this story pulls you in, tap that like button right now, hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next, and send this to someone who's ever been underestimated by their own family. My name is David Turner. I'm 54 years old. And for 7 years, my father-in-law thought I was a grown man living off his daughter's paycheck. He wasn't shy about saying it, either. Not at dinner, not at birthdays, not even at my own son's graduation. He'd say it with a laugh, like it was harmless. Like I couldn't hear the weight behind the joke. The last time it happened, we were standing in my sister-in-law's kitchen in Fort Collins, Colorado, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Frank Doyle, my wife's father, was leaning against the counter with a beer in his hand, talking to my brother-in-law about a warehouse position opening up at the distribution center he managed. Forklift certified. $14 an hour to start. Full benefits after 90 days. He looked right at me when he said it. David, you should think about it. Steady hours. Something dependable. Might be good for you at this stage of life. He said at this stage of life, the way you talk to someone who'd given up. My wife Sarah, standing beside the stove, went quiet in a way I recognized instantly. 29 years of marriage teaches you the difference between her ordinary silence and the kind that means she's holding back a storm. I didn't say anything that night. I never did. I just nodded, said I'd think about it, and helped myself to more mashed potatoes. That was the pattern. Frank would throw the insult. I'd swallow it. Sarah would seethe. And 2 days later, we'd all pretend it never happened. But here's the thing nobody in that kitchen knew. 11 days before that conversation, I had received an email that would have changed the entire tone of the room if I'd read it out loud right then and there. I didn't. I kept it in my pocket, figuratively and literally, for almost 2 weeks. And the reason I kept quiet wasn't fear. It was something closer to curiosity. I wanted to see exactly how far they'd go before the truth came out on its own terms, not theirs. To understand why that email mattered so much, you need to go back further. Not 11 days. 7 years. 7 years earlier, I was a project manager at a regional logistics company outside Denver. Decent title, decent pay, absolutely miserable. I spent my days managing shipping delays that were never actually my fault and my nights answering emails from a director who thought work-life balance was a phrase invented by people who didn't want success badly enough. I was averaging 4 hours of sleep a night. My blood pressure was climbing. My doctor used the word concerning twice in one appointment, and I still went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was driving to the office, same route I'd taken for 6 years, when my hands started shaking on the wheel. Not nerves. Something physical, something my body was doing without asking permission. I pulled into the parking lot, put the car in park, and sat there staring at the building, unable to make myself get out. My chest felt like someone had wrapped a belt around it and kept tightening. I called Sarah. She picked up on the first ring, the way she always did when something in my voice told her it mattered. I can't go in, I said. That was it. 4 words. She didn't ask why. She just said, then don't. I'm coming to get you. 2 weeks later, I resigned.
No dramatic exit, no confrontation.
I gave my notice, trained my replacement, and walked out with a handshake that felt more like relief on the company's part than mine. When Sarah told her family, she chose her words carefully. David's stepping away from the corporate world to build something of his own. Frank heard exactly one part of that sentence. David quit his job. From that point forward, I became the family's cautionary tale. Not cruel exactly, at least not at first. Just diminished. Frank called it David's little hobby. My mother-in-law, Linda, would ask Sarah in a hushed voice whether I'd started looking for real work yet, as if my entire existence had become a temporary embarrassment everyone was waiting to outgrow. The strange part was, I never corrected any of it. Not once. I told myself that letting Frank talk was easier than explaining a business nobody in the family could picture. At holidays, the digs kept coming, small at first, then sharper with time. Frank started calling me the house husband, which always got a laugh from whoever was closest to him. Linda would ask Sarah, in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, whether I'd started sending out resumes yet, as if my company was a phase everyone was patiently waiting for me to outgrow. Even Tyler picked it up, the way kids absorb whatever earns a laugh at the dinner table. Every time, I smiled the same tired smile and let it go, and every time, a small piece of me filed it away. What none of them understood was what I was actually building. I had spent years quietly teaching myself cybersecurity architecture, the kind of skill set that didn't exist when I started my career but had become desperately necessary as small businesses moved everything online without knowing how exposed they really were. I wasn't writing apps for fun. I was building a threat detection system, something that could flag unusual login behavior, unauthorized access attempts, and credential theft before a company lost everything to a breach they didn't even know was happening. It was unglamorous work. No suits, no conference rooms, no applause. Just me, a laptop, and a spare bedroom that slowly filled with monitors and cold coffee cups. There was no logo on a truck, no uniform, no title anyone in Sarah's family would recognize as a real job. Just lines of code, failed demos, server bills, and long nights listening to the furnace click on while the rest of the house slept. Sarah worked as a nurse manager at a hospital in Fort Collins, and some nights she'd come home from a 12-hour shift and find me still at my desk, eyes red, chasing a bug that had been breaking my code since morning. I remember one night in particular. It was almost 2 a.m, and a monitoring feature I'd spent months building had failed during a live test with a client. In cybersecurity, a few minutes of delay might as well be a few days. I sat there with my head in my hands, staring at an error log that made no sense. Sarah came upstairs in one of my old college sweatshirts, took one look at the screen, and asked if it could be fixed. Eventually, I told her. And if it can't? Then I update my resume, I said, half joking, mostly not. She reached over and closed my laptop. I stared at her like she'd just switched off a lifeline. You've been fighting this for 14 hours, she said. You don't have time not to sleep. Then she pulled me toward bed, and for the first time all day, we both actually laughed. Nights like that didn't fix anything on their own. But they reminded me I wasn't carrying the weight by myself, even when it felt that way. Did you eat? She'd ask, and I'd realize I genuinely didn't know what time it was. She never once complained about the years when the business made almost nothing. There were months I paid contractors and server fees and had nothing left over for myself. I remember one October, staring at our bank statement while she unpacked groceries, doing math in my head instead of looking up at her. You've been doing that math for 3 years, she said gently, not as an accusation, just an observation. I know, I told her. I just need it to work. I didn't marry your income, she said. I married you. That sentence carried me through more sleepless nights than I can count. By year 4, things started shifting. Word of mouth is a strange, slow engine, but eventually it catches. Small businesses that used my monitoring software began recommending it to other small businesses. One client became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became 60. I wasn't rich. I was finally breathing. Then, in a year everyone remembers for different reasons, Frank's own business nearly collapsed. He ran a small fleet of delivery trucks, and when everything shut down, his contracts dried up overnight. Sarah came to me one Saturday, hesitant, almost embarrassed to even bring it up. My dad's behind on payroll, she said. The bank turned him down for loan. I didn't need to think long. Frank employed 12 people. 12 families depended on those paychecks, whatever Frank himself thought of me. So we went to an attorney. Everything was documented properly. $110,000, structured as a legitimate loan, wired from my business account, papers signed, terms set. Sarah delivered the documents herself. I stayed home. She came back that evening and told me he'd cried. He told her she was lucky to have a level head about money, meaning her, not me. I didn't correct it. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as the 12 families kept their jobs. The night before Sarah delivered those documents, I sat at the kitchen table turning the whole thing over in my mind. Part of me wanted her to tell Frank the truth right there. hand in the paperwork and say my name out loud. But I stopped her at the door. "Let him think it's you," I said. "It'll mean more to him coming from his own daughter." She looked at me for a long moment, like she wanted to argue, then just nodded and left. I've thought about that decision more times than I can count since. A year after that, Linda needed a hip replacement that insurance wouldn't fully cover. The gap was almost $35,000, enough to make her postpone the surgery and live with pain that kept her up at night. Sarah brought me the estimate without a word, just handed it over and waited. "We can cover it," I said. The money moved the same quiet way. Linda thanked Sarah in the hospital room while I peeled an orange for her from a plastic tray, and she smiled at me the way you smile at someone who's finally being helpful for once. She had no idea that the reason she wasn't in pain anymore was sitting 3 feet away from her, saying nothing. Then there was my nephew, Tyler, Frank's son. He graduated college with a mountain of debt, and when his car transmission failed the same month his rent went up, he was drowning. Sarah told me about it over dinner, and within a week, most of his debt was gone. He believed his Aunt Sarah had bailed him out again. At a summer barbecue not long after, he stood at the grill and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Uncle David, you should teach me how to get paid for doing nothing." People laughed. Not cruelly, just carelessly, the way people laugh at something they assume has always been true. I let it go. I always let it go. That night, washing dishes, Sarah asked me again, the way she'd started asking every few months, "Can I please just tell them where the money actually comes from?" "Not yet," I said. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "peace is just another word for postponing the truth." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know if I ever really did. I told myself I was protecting the family from money changing how they treated each other. Looking back, I think I was protecting myself from a confrontation I wasn't ready to have. If you've made it this far, you already know something is about to break loose in this story, and it does. But before we get there, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever underestimated your quiet years, the ones where you were building something they couldn't see? Type quiet years in the comments if that's you, and don't forget to like this video before we keep going, because the next part is where everything changes. 11 days before that Thanksgiving in Fort Collins, I was sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold when an email arrived from a law firm in Chicago. The subject line read, "Final closing confirmation, Meridian Threat Systems acquisition." I read it once, then read it again slower, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less real. The acquisition had closed. 7 years of work, sold to a national cybersecurity firm that wanted to fold my detection technology into their enterprise platform. The number attached to the wire transfer was more money than anyone in Sarah's family believed existed outside of movies. I sat there in stunned quiet while downstairs I could hear Sarah humming while she made breakfast, completely unaware that our lives had just shifted underneath her. I didn't tell her right away. I didn't tell anyone. I carried that email around in my head for 11 days, through grocery runs and dentist appointments and one uncomfortable dinner where Frank asked me, again, whether I'd thought more about that warehouse position. The morning of Thanksgiving, Sarah found me in my office, still staring at the acquisition documents even though I'd memorized every line by then. "Are you sure you still want to go?" she asked. "We've never skipped Thanksgiving," I said. "This year feels different," she said. Then, after a pause, "You don't owe anyone another performance, David." That word stuck with me the whole drive to Fort Collins. Performance. Because that's exactly what I'd been doing for 7 years. Playing the harmless punchline. Nodding along. Letting people believe whatever story was easiest for them. Frank's house was already loud when we arrived. Trucks lined the street, kids were tossing a football in the frozen yard, and the smell of turkey and cinnamon hit us the second the door opened. Linda hugged me first, walking noticeably better than she had in years, though nobody at that table knew why. Tyler handed me a sparkling water without being asked and, for the first time in a long while, actually asked me a real question. "What exactly does your company do?" he said, glancing around like he didn't want his dad to hear him being curious. "We help businesses catch hackers before they cause damage," I told him, honestly, for the first time in years. He nodded slowly. "Huh. I never actually knew that." Before I could say more, Frank's voice boomed from the kitchen, calling Tyler over to help with the turkey, and the moment passed. The dining room was packed the way it always was, more than 20 people crammed around a table meant for 12, kids weaving between chairs, the television murmuring a football game nobody was really watching. The smell of turkey and sage and cinnamon candles filled every corner of the house. For a few minutes, sitting there with a plate in front of me, it almost felt like an ordinary holiday. Dinner started normally enough. Football, gas prices, Tyler's recent promotion, Linda's physical therapy. The usual noise families make when they're avoiding the things that actually matter. Then Frank noticed the pie Sarah and I had picked up from a bakery that morning. "Store-bought," he said, grinning. Figured a man with all that free time would have learned to bake by now. A few people laughed. I smiled the tired smile I'd perfected over 7 years and said nothing. 20 minutes into dinner, Frank stood up and tapped his glass with a knife. The table went quiet the way it always does when someone signals they're about to make a scene. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I talked to my warehouse manager," he announced, sliding it toward me across the table. $14 an hour to start. Benefits after 90 days. No shame in starting over, David. Especially at our age. Somebody at the far end let out an uncomfortable laugh. Sarah's fork hit her plate. "That's enough, Dad," she said. "I'm helping him," Frank said, spreading his hands like he was the victim here. "Somebody's got to." "You're humiliating him," Sarah said, her voice shaking now. I reached over and touched her wrist, and she looked at me, confused, waiting for me to shrink the way I always did. Instead, I picked up the piece of paper, turned it over once in my hands, and set it down beside my plate. "Actually, Frank," I said, "I think it's time I showed you something." The room went still. I took out my phone, and instead of opening my banking app, which would have looked like showing off, I opened my email. The confirmation from the Chicago law firm was still pinned at the top of my inbox. I turned the screen so the people closest to me could see it. 11 days ago, I said, the company I've spent the last 7 years building was acquired by a national cybersecurity firm. Frank laughed, assuming I was joking. "Okay, sure." I scrolled to the transaction summary and read the number out loud. $42 million, initial distribution. Tyler's eyes went wide first. Linda covered her mouth. Frank reached for the phone like he needed to hold it himself to believe it, scrolling through page after page of legal documents, all carrying my name. "This has to be fake," he muttered, but his voice had already lost its certainty. "It's not," I said. "And there's more you should know." I looked at Frank first. "Do you remember the year your bank turned you down for a loan? The $110,000 that kept your company open and 12 families employed? That didn't come from Sarah's savings. It came from me." Frank's face went through about 3 different expressions before landing on something like disbelief. "You," he said, not quite a question. "The whole time." He looked at Sarah, then back at me, and for once, he didn't have a comeback ready. I turned to Linda next. "The surgery you'd been putting off because of the cost. That came from me too. I just wanted you walking again, and I didn't need credit for it." Linda pressed both hands over her mouth, and I watched tears slide down over her fingers. "I judged you," she whispered. "For years, I judged you, and you were the reason I could even have that operation." Then I looked at Tyler, and I could see he already knew what was coming before I said it. "Your student loans. The car. That wasn't Aunt Sarah pulling strings. That was your company, the one you joked about at every barbecue." His face went red, and he stared down at his plate like he wanted to disappear into it. "I told everyone you got paid for doing nothing," he said quietly. "I know," I told him. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth, the same as everyone else at this table." Each revelation landed heavier than the last, and by the end, nobody at that table was laughing anymore. Frank sat there staring at the paper he'd slid toward me 20 minutes earlier, and for the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. I picked up his job offer, smoothed the corner between my fingers, and slid it gently back toward him. "I appreciate it," I said. but I think I'll stick with my little internet business." Nobody laughed at that line either. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that settles over a room when people finally understand something they'd gotten wrong for years. We didn't stay much longer after that. Sarah gathered our coats, and on the drive home, neither of us said much until she reached over and took my hand. "I should have stopped them years ago," she said. "I didn't let you," I told her. "You shouldn't have had to," she said, and she was right. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever swallowed an insult because peace felt easier than the truth, I want you to know you're not alone in that, and I'd love to hear your story in the comments. While you're down there, tap subscribe, because what happened in the weeks after that Thanksgiving is honestly more interesting than the dinner itself, and I don't want you to miss it. The calls started the next morning. Frank tried 3 times before noon. I let them go to voicemail. It wasn't anger keeping me from answering. It was clarity. For 7 years I had answered every call, solved every problem, absorbed every joke. One quiet Friday wasn't going to hurt anyone. A few days later, Linda showed up at our door holding a bakery box with both hands, the kind of gesture that told me she hadn't trusted herself to bake without crying. She sat at our kitchen table and, without excuses or deflection, apologized. Not a rehearsed speech. Just honesty. "I judged work I didn't understand," she said. "I never realized you'd never actually stopped working. I just couldn't see it." I believed her, because there wasn't a single but attached to what she said. Tyler reached out next, asking to meet for coffee instead of asking for money, which felt like progress in itself. We met at a small shop near the river, and he was already there when I arrived, standing up almost nervously as I walked in. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he admitted. "You asked for coffee," I said. "I figured I owed you at least one honest conversation." He laughed a little, the tension breaking, and we sat by the window for a long while, mostly quiet at first. Eventually he set down his cup and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology. Every joke I ever made, at every barbecue, every holiday. I copied my dad because that's what got a laugh in our house. I never once thought about how it actually landed on you." I told him there had been a lot of jokes over the years, more than he probably remembered, and he didn't try to argue or minimize it. He just nodded and let it sit there between us, which honestly meant more than any apology dressed up with excuses. Then, for the first time, he asked real questions about what my company actually did, and I answered every one of them honestly. When I explained how the software worked, watching for unusual login behavior before a breach could do real damage, he sat back and said something that stuck with me. "I guess you were protecting people this whole time. Just not with a tool belt." He wasn't wrong, and I told him so. Frank took the longest. Nearly 3 weeks passed before he showed up at our door one evening, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He talked about his father, his grandfather, generations of men who measured worth by callus and steel-toe boots. He admitted he'd decided my work wasn't real simply because it didn't look familiar to him. Then, almost on cue, he mentioned his business was struggling again. I understood immediately what he was working up to ask, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't reach for my wallet before he even finished the sentence. "I already saved your company once," I told him. "You just didn't know it was me. I'm not writing another check to buy respect I should have had for free." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. As he left, he turned back and said, "I spent years trying to teach you what a real man looked like. I never realized I was standing next to one the whole time." Then he walked into the cold, and I closed the door without needing to say anything else. Christmas that year felt different, not because everyone suddenly became perfect, but because nobody was pretending anymore. Linda walked in without her cane for the first time in years. Tyler brought cookies he'd bake himself and laughed about finally learning something that didn't involve a power drill. Frank arrived quietly, without a speech, and simply shook my hand like an equal. But old habits don't disappear overnight, even after a moment like that. Halfway through dessert, a cousin leaned toward me with a hopeful smile and mentioned a neighbor with a business idea who could really use the right kind of investor. Someone else asked if I could get their son an internship at one of those big tech companies. Nobody was laughing at me anymore. Some of them had simply started looking at me differently, as a wallet instead of a punchline. Same mistake, different shape. Later, washing dishes together, Sarah summed it up perfectly. They've gone from underestimating you to overestimating your bank account. She wasn't wrong, and that night we sat down and wrote out boundaries for the first time in our marriage. No more quiet loans without paperwork. No more hiding the truth to protect someone else's pride. And if anyone disrespected either of us again, we agreed we'd simply leave the room, no arguments necessary. Spring came, and with it, small signs that the changes were sticking. Frank sold off an old delivery truck he barely used anymore instead of asking me to cover another rough month. He renegotiated a couple of equipment leases and, at Tyler's insistence, finally modernized the scheduling software his company had been limping along with for a decade. None of it was dramatic. It was just steady, quiet effort, the kind I understood better than anyone at that table. One Saturday morning, Tyler showed up at my door with his laptop under his arm. "I've been taking an online course," he said, almost sheepish about it. "Cybersecurity basics. Figured if my uncle could teach himself an entire industry in his 50s, I've got no excuse in my 30s. We spent the whole afternoon going through networking fundamentals together, and watching him ask genuine questions, patient and curious in a way I recognized from my own early years, told me more than any apology could have. People really can change, if you give the truth enough room to work on them. Months later, an envelope arrived in the mail, Frank's handwriting on the front. Inside was a card with only a few lines. "I spent too many years judging work I didn't understand. Thank you for helping my family when I couldn't. I was wrong about what real work looks like." No request attached, no mention of money, just an honest admission. I kept it in a drawer where I keep things that actually matter. People sometimes ask if revealing everything at that dinner table was some kind of revenge. It wasn't. The timing of the acquisition was simply a coincidence that happened to land on the same day as the cruelest joke Frank ever made. The real shift wasn't the money at all. It was the decision to stop paying for other people's comfort with my own silence. I don't regret helping Frank keep his business alive. I don't regret paying for Linda's surgery. I don't regret giving Tyler a fresh start. If I had to make those same choices again, knowing everything I know now, I still would. What I would do differently is stop hiding the truth about who I was just to keep everyone else comfortable. Respect built on a misunderstanding isn't respect. It's just a temporary peace waiting to be broken. Real peace, the kind that actually lasts, starts the moment you're willing to be honest about yourself, even when that honesty makes the room uncomfortable. It took me most of a lifetime to understand that quietly enduring disrespect isn't the same as rising above it. I used to believe silence made me the bigger person. Looking back, silence just gave other people permission to keep writing my story for me, one small joke at a time, until an entire family believed a version of me that had never actually existed. That Thanksgiving didn't make me wealthy. The paperwork had already done that 11 days earlier, quietly, without an audience. What actually changed that night was something far more valuable. I stopped letting people who never once asked about my work decide what that work was worth. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best, if you've ever smiled through an insult because speaking up felt harder than staying quiet, I hope this story reminds you that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it just needs a moment to finally speak for itself. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe right now so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment telling me which part hit you the hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear that their quiet years are building something real. I'll see you in the next video.